I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Old Oscar Countdown. And this week we're going to be talking about the music-based categories, the Best Original Song, Best Original Score, and Best Sound categories, to talk about what I think will get nominated for the 2026 Oscars. But if you're new to the series, welcome. What I do every single week, and sometimes now multiple times a week, is talk about all things awards. The flagship part of this countdown is deep dives and breakdowns into these individual categories, doing 15-20 minutes on an individual category to talk about my picks, because I find that this is where you actually do well on your Oscar nominations. People sometimes stress over who's going to get in for Best Actress, but when you try to look at your overall entire predictions, sometimes being very accurate and having a lot of consideration for the technical categories are just as important as the above-the-line categories. So use this ultimately as a guide. I'm not trying to tell you what you should predict, but also what just generally I am predicting. Lay out the race for you, talk about some pros and cons to some of the top contenders, ultimately giving my picks, but I also include a couple of possible contenders as well, so you understand kind of where the race stands right now. Now, these aren't my final predictions. That will be, released in one video a few days before the Oscars, but a lot of my thinking and my process and my reasoning and the research that I did to make the predictions now on our 10th season of Accurate Predictions happens in these videos. But if you're a returning viewer, welcome. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. What are your thoughts on generally these categories? Do you feel confident in them? Do you not? What are your predictions for these categories if you've made them yet? Or if you have any just general questions, I'd love to hear that down below. But without further ado, let's jump into things. If you want to hear my thoughts on a certain category, feel free to use the timestamps in the description below. We're going to start off, though, with the Best Original Score category. And my first pick is going to be Sinners. This is from two-time winner Ludwig Göransson, which was a big reason as to why I picked this movie here. This category, more so than many of the other below-the-line categories, really loves past nominees. We've seen people like John Williams get nominated 50 times, or Alexander Desplat get nominated, 15 times, or something crazy like that. We see a lot of the same names every single year, and Ludwig is kind of one of those composers now. Has already won twice, including a couple of years ago for Oppenheimer, and nominated a few times aside from that. Now he has Sinners, which is this very music-based movie, and a movie in many ways about music. So the score kind of fits in really well at kind of amplifying those genre elements, but also providing something new. The movie is also just generally a movie I expect to be highly nominated, with a great score in connection to it as well. So it's not a hard and fast rule of you have to have someone who's a past nominee, but it's helpful that you have a really liked movie that's really all about kind of music and the score from a two-time winner, someone that they highly respect. I think it's an automatic, obvious kind of a lock for a nomination. Then my next pick, I went with One Battle After Another, a similar kind of a lock, just maybe a little bit of a step down, because this is from Johnny Greenwood, who, unlike Ludwig Göransson, hasn't won any Oscars and has only been nominated a few times. That being said, he has been nominated a few times. I do think this score is a little bit more easy to listen to than some of his earlier work, with something like maybe a There Will Be Blood, or even something like a You Were Never Really Here, where it is noticeable for sure, but also it is got a little bit more traditional elements in terms of its piano, in terms of its use of strings, a little bit less experimental than what he's done in the past. I would imagine kind of similar to a movie like Paul Thomas Anderson directed and Johnny Greenwood's score for Phantom Thread, where like that movie you have wall-to-wall music. I mean, most of One Battle After Another has some element of score. And we've seen this branch in the Academy like that generally, whether it be a couple of years ago for Oppenheimer, or few years before when you had Justin Hurwitz for Babylon. When you have these scores that are noticeable in your face and there's a lot of score and the score is playing almost throughout the entire movie, it helps just kind of underpin the appreciation there, because of the actual intense amount of work that had to be done to get all of that music, but then also how integral it is to the success of the film. And I think that's the case here, where you have One Battle After Another, which is the frontrunner to win right now for Best Picture, and you have a score almost throughout the entire movie. So it would be odd for this not to get nominated, because then people would be saying, I like the movie, except the what it sounds like for 90% of the time. So you have a past nominee, you have a well-liked movie, and you have a very kind of notable, in-your-face score, and just in the sense that it's being played throughout the entire movie with some distinct character themes. I think this is a pretty easy lock of a nomination. And then my third pick, I went with Hamnet. This is from legendary composer Max Richter, who's never been nominated for an Oscar, but is well known. His music's been used in Arrival and Shutter Island and The Leftovers on the TV side of things. And he has done a couple of original scores, but I think this will be the first time he gets nominated. I think critically, most of my reasoning for why I wanted to include this was because of his kind of famous use of On the Nature of Daylight being included within the film, and ultimately this being a movie that qualifies for this Best Score Oscar. Usually this branch is very strict in terms of what types of scores qualify, and in particular if they have pre-existing music, they won't necessarily qualify for this category. But Max Richter did qualify, so that's kind of out of the way. It did make the shortlist, so it's a contender. So let's just take that off the board in terms of a possibility of it getting snubbed or anything like that. It's going to be eligible. And this is a movie that makes you cry. If you really like it, you become emotionally moved. And at the emotional climax of the movie, there is a particular piece of pre-existing music, but done by Max Richter, called On the Nature of Daylight. Now, it's been used successfully in other films like Shutter Island and Arrival, but I don't think a lot of people will necessarily recognize the piece of music. You have to be kind of like a serious film fan. I think a lot of people that are emotionally moved by the movie, that feel connected to it, they become emotionally kind of overwhelmed at this moment, at the exact same moment in which you have this really great piece play, and it just kind of overwhelms you in that emotion. And there's a tense connection between your liking of the movie and your crying and your, emotional movement to the song that's playing at the exact same time. Now, he does do a lot of other work throughout the rest of the film, but why I'm including it here is because this is a movie that I think is going to be well liked, that's going to be nominated for Best Picture and Best Director and maybe win Best Actress. And the emotional climax of the movie, the main center, is underlined and emphasized with this integral piece of music by Max Richter. So I think people will just associate, I really like this movie and it had great music at the right moment when I was really engaged in it. Let's nominate it here for Best Score. I think that's the connection there. And even though Max hasn't been nominated before, legendary composer, great opportunity to nominate him. Then my fourth pick, I went with Frankenstein. And even though it's in my fourth pick, this is another movie I'm very confident in, because we've talked about past nominees being really integral to this category, or the use of it, or the amount of music within it. But one part that we haven't mentioned is the fact that many times the nominees in this category are also Best Picture nominees. As a matter of fact, over the past 3 years, for 3 years in a row, exactly 4 out of the 5 nominees for Best Original Score were also nominated for Best Picture. So let's take a look at what we have here. Frankenstein, a movie that I think is very likely to get nominated for Best Picture. That only helps. Same thing with Hamnet, same thing with One Battle, same thing with Sinners. So it fits this kind of a trend very clearly. We know that this branch likes and has similar taste to what gets nominated for Best Picture, or at least over the past 3 years. And then you have the composer itself, who's Alexander Desplat, multiple-time winner, many-time nominee. Really, in the 2010s, he was getting nominated almost every single year, it seemed like. And recently, he has kind of been on a bit of a cold streak. There's been some opportunities, whether it be The Midnight Sky or Pinocchio, where I remember actually predicting him to get nominated, and ultimately he didn't get nominated. So there's a little bit of hesitancy here for me to actually kind of put my full chest behind him and say, no, he's going to get nominated for this film. But that's only because of his recent performance. But when we kind of look at it logically, we go, of course, something like The Midnight Sky didn't get nominated just because that's a not super well-beloved movie. Well, now in this case, he has, a collaboration here with Guillermo del Toro, who he worked on and won an Oscar for The Shape of Water. Frankenstein, a movie that I think is going to get a lot of nominations, including Best Picture, which has a notable score. I think fits the mood of the film very well. So I just kind of do the calculation. I go, Alexander Desplat, well-liked past nominee, in a category that likes well-liked past nominees, except this time he has a movie that's going to be in a strong contention, easily get nominated for Best Picture, multiple other nominations, and we know this category likes Best Picture type movies, so there's just kind of that perfect marriage here, where even though it's in that fourth slot, still very confident that this is going to get in as well. And then with my fifth pick, I went with Sirāt. And I mentioned my top 4 I'm very confident in. And really, this is a category where I feel very confident in the top 6. The question now becomes, in the fifth spot, which of the 2 do I choose? And for me, those 2 movies that it came down to were either Sirāt or F1. And the reason why I came down to those 2 movies was because last year, what I did was I looked at all of my past predictions and where I got them wrong for each and every category. And for the score category, what I noticed as a pattern was that every time I would get a prediction wrong, it was either because of two things. It was either because it was a movie that was nominated for Best Picture that was kind of surging at the right time, or it was kind of a legendary composer who they liked. So someone like I didn't predict John Williams for The Dial of Destiny, or I didn't predict American Fiction the year it got nominated, actually the same year as Dial of Destiny, or situations like that. Everything Everywhere All at Once, I remember in it was 22. So what I did last year was I predicted Wicked because it fit that kind of qualifier of rising late and past nominee in John Powell, and I was correct. I ended up going 5 for 5 in that category. Felt good about that. So I tried to apply the same philosophy here. Feel good about that top 4, that 5th spot. Which one am I going to pick? I could even technically pick Marty Supreme or Bugonia or things like that, but I narrowed it down to Sirāt or F1 because F1 kind of fits the mold of a past nominee, a legend, Hans Zimmer. Similar to me, not predicting someone like a John Williams. Kind of fits that mold. And then Sirāt, I think, is a movie that fits the mold of an American Fiction or an Everything Everywhere All at Once or a Wicked last year. A movie that maybe wasn't on our radars at the beginning of the Oscar season, but at every single award show kept on showing up, and starts to rise and kind of maybe peaks as Oscar nominations eventually come out. And ultimately, what I went with was Sirāt. I think that, at the end of the day, we have the Oscar shortlist. And the Oscar shortlist from every single branch indicated to us that there's an appreciation for this film technically. Not only for something like score, but also the sound, also the cinematography, things like that. I did think it was notable, though, that it got nominated for both score and sound, that people think about this movie, they think about the kind of music of it. Now, this is an electronic score, and this is not something that the Academy and this branch particularly likes. That being said, the other contender, F1, or even another contender in something like Marty Supreme, are electronic based and electronic focused. So, that's kind of a moot point in a way. So both kind of electronic picks. I went with Sirāt because it's rising earlier because we have the strength of Oscar shortlists, and because if you've seen the film, there is this kind of pounding electronic music in large stretches of the film, and the score is very noticeable and in your face in that regard. The question then becomes for me is will people think about it as a score or maybe just electronic music that was borrowed? That's a question that I have, but it was nominated at the Golden Globe, so there is a little bit of an appreciation there already for the score in particular. Going to be a real kind of tough battle. I'm not 100% convinced with Sirāt, but I wanted to go and kind of jump ahead with the fact that it's rising, which is important for me. It's an international movie. I love to over-index in international films, and it felt like that was kind of the most appropriate option. But my other possible contender, my first possible contender, my 6th pick of a sorts, would be F1, Hans Zimmer. Don't want to bet against him necessarily, although he's not a guaranteed every single year kind of a guy. Many years he doesn't get nominated or isn't even really in contention. F1 is a movie that will get a couple of other nominations, so that's a strong sign of support there. And then my other possible contender I went with, I already mentioned it, was Bugonia. Showed up over something like a Marty Supreme at the Society of Composers and Lyricists, which is kind of the score guild of sorts. We can also look at the Golden Globes or Critics' Choice Awards, and I think that you have benefits of Jerskin Fendrix being a pastime nominee for Poor Things, which helps. You have the score in the film itself being very booming and in your face and loud and unique and kind of dissonant to what we're seeing on screen, which helps make it stand out. That being said, it hasn't been really critically acclaimed as much as maybe I thought it would be. You're not seeing Bugonia on a lot of top 10 of the year lists. So I think ultimately this is a movie that's going to maybe start out strong. It had kind of high Oscar hopes, but over the course of the coming weeks, we're starting to see things, maybe die down a bit. And maybe it gets in for Emma Stone and then screenplay, and then maybe that's it. Or maybe only one nomination total. That's a possibility too. Now let's talk about the sound category and my predictions there. My first pick, I went with Sinners. Like the score category, I think this is going to be a movie that is well liked, and it's so integral in terms of it kind of being kind of a music-based movie. Music is an integral part to the film, so when you think about the sound element, it kind of works in both ways. It's an action horror movie, so you have gunshots and you have great sound effects, but then also it's a movie about music. So you have the kind of traditionally sound mixing side of things and mixing in the music with the overlapping elements of dialogue and things like that. So it's kind of a classical pick. that is so integral to music. So I think people who watch the movie will just automatically think of, okay, score and sound, that kind of makes sense. But then also it fits both of the appreciations within this kind of guild, which likes both the mixing and the editing side of things, which it has. And then the team behind it, you have a combined total of 5 Oscar nominations in the past. So an experienced, prestigious team, including Benny Burt, who is a legendary sound designer and editor, Ben Burt's son. He also worked on, I believe it was F1. So there's some, potential two-time nominees here. But I do think Sinners just is a movie that's going to be well liked and has that kind of beautiful blend of both music and the kind of action horror sequences too, that has appreciated that on the sound editing side of things. But speaking there of Benny Burt, my second pick, I went with F1, which is another movie I'm very confident we'll get in here. A classical pick. We've seen racing-based movies like Ford v Ferrari, or even just like vehicle-type movies like Top Gun Maverick get nominated here. And it makes sense when you're seeing the film, whether it be the revving of the engines or the screeching of the tires. Things are loud. This, despite being an Apple movie as well, was shown in movie theaters and made $600 million and was a big deal for Apple, but also for many people seeing the movie in theaters. And I think when you look at the past sound nominees, oftentimes they're blockbusters, oftentimes they're movies that are seen in theaters. And it helps because you have this great sound system all around you, so you notice the sound design a little bit more than some small indie movie that you see on your TV. And I mentioned Sinners having, a combined 5 Oscar nominations from its sound team. Well, this one's even more prestigious. Sinners had 5 nominations. This team here has a combined 4 Oscars and many more nominations as well. So really kind of A-list team here has been nominated many times before. So intense amount of appreciation for these people in particular and the work they do. And then the movie itself, like I mentioned with the loud sounds of the cars, just is a perfect kind of a fit. Be very surprised if F1 doesn't get nominated here. And then my third pick, I went with One Battle After Another, which is actually a prediction that not a lot of people totally have, or maybe they have it in their 5th or 6th spot. I was a little bit surprised to see that initially because I think it's kind of a slam dunk of a pick. Not only do we see Best Picture frontrunners overperform in this category, we'll see nominations for something like The Shape of Water, which doesn't on its first blush I think have super noticeable sound, but we'll see that get nominated here. We'll see movies like Power of the Dog, for example, get nominated in the sound category. It is a little bit more of a trend with the kind of Best Picture frontrunner at the time than you would think. In part just because of something we've talked about, where if it's the most well-liked movie of the year, it's going to be well-liked by a lot of individual branches. So definitely could be a consideration just from the fact of One Battle After Another is the Best Picture frontrunner right now, so that alone should make it be a consideration here. Then you think the content of the film. It's unique in other Best Picture frontrunners in that it's a action movie still. This is, even if it wasn't a Best Picture frontrunner, I still think I would include it in my predictions here. It's got kind of gunshots and, car chase sequences. So the screeching of the tires that F1 has, or the gunshots that Sinners has, One Battle After Another has both. So the chance for me to over-index and make a prediction here for One Battle After Another, and then also it makes sense in terms of the nominees, felt like a natural kind of a pick here. And then my fourth pick in this category, I went with Avatar: Fire and Ash. And this is mostly because this movie is a blockbuster. And I looked over the past 3 years. I just did the past 3 years because I wanted to avoid the COVID year, but this trend exists all the way back for many years. If you look at the past 3 years, though, there's an average of 3.5 out of the 5 nominees that have a budget of $50 million or more. So that's just to say not movies that get nominated in this category aren't the smaller independent films. They are the big-time blockbusters. And we see this even this year with the shortlist. So you look at the shortlist contenders, it's Mission Impossible, it's Avatar, it's Superman, it's these big kind of blockbuster-type movies. And if you think about it on paper, it makes sense. Lots of times you're seeing these big blockbusters in a theater. They're action-packed, they've got action-focused, which means a lot of intense kind of sound effects. People are noticing them because they're seeing them in the movie theaters with this great surround sound system. So I wanted to include in my picks here not just the kind of well-liked movies, but also the blockbusters. And Avatar is the ultimate blockbuster. The ultimate blockbuster that's releasing late, that's going to have top-of-mind awareness. And even though we've seen kind of mixed reviews, and I've never really included it in my Best Picture contention and Best Picture rankings, it is still a movie that I think has an intense amount of technical appreciation. So I think it's going to get nominated for something like production design, as well as something like visual effects. and sound. I think, the first movie got nominated, so did the second movie. Blockbusters do well. It's got action sequences, it's got creature screeching. So it is more of a atypical type of a nominee. So even though I think it has some more mixed reviews, I still think there's going to be an intense amount of appreciation for the technical craft that goes into these movies, and sound being a key part of that, based on the fact that the other two Avatar movies got nominated for sound. This is a late releasing, top of mind awareness always helps. It's going to be a big blockbuster hit. People are going to be watching this movie and then a couple weeks later voting on the Oscars. That is always going to help in terms of these nominations, and it fits kind of the mold of what we've seen these big blockbuster type movies get nominated for sound. And then my fifth pick, I went with Sirāt. And this is kind of my quote-unquote cool pick. Because sometimes this category and the Oscars have some cool picks. I remember the Zone of Interest. People would say like, hey, if you actually watch the movie, the sound is really integral. And then it was a bit of a surprise it got nominated. And then it was even more of a surprise in my mind when it actually won. But that's because people were watching the films. And when you watch the film, it was notable that the Zone of Interest had this kind of unique sound. Same thing with even a few years ago when we had Sound of Metal. That was a classic. If you watch the movie, it's all about sound and the audio experience, and that's a huge part of the film. I think Sirāt similarly here, without saying anything in particular, but the movie has these sequences during a rave. So you have these intense electronic musics, and then the combination of that with the quietness of the desert at another period of time, there is these kind of great auditory experiences throughout the film. And one thing I haven't mentioned is that not too long ago, this category was split into two: Best Sound Editing and Best Sound Mixing. And the Best Sound Editing category liked a lot of the kind of like action type movies, and it was more about the sound effects. In Sound Mixing, we're more preferable to music-based movies or musicals, because it was more about how the music blended in within the dialogue and things like that. And ever since the two categories combined into one, we've seen mostly a sound editing preference. So a lot of action movies, a lot of big blockbusters. But every year, there's at least one kind of quote-unquote sound mixing pick. So a musical like Wicked, or music-based movies like A Complete Unknown or Maestro. Maestro doesn't have a lot of interesting sound effects. It's about the music. It's about the sound, the score, and how that's intertwined into everything. So we look at my other picks. You can kind of say Sinners is a little bit like that, a music-based movie. But really with my fifth pick, I want to include a music type of a movie. And while Sirāt isn't that obvious pick right away, it is the music pick of the year. It's not as obvious as something like a Maestro, but it is so integral to the film, the score, the sound, the electronic music, and how that's kind of intertwined throughout the story. It's a real kind of auditory feat in that sense. So it's going to be a cool pick. It's going to be a movie that we know is well liked, I think, and well seen, and made the shortlist, as did score, as did cinematography. And similar to something like this Zone of Interest or Sound of Metal, when you see the movie, it's kind of obvious. So based on the fact that we know that the Academy has seen the movie and likes the movie because it's been making a lot of shortlists, we know that the sound is a critical part of the film. So I'd be surprised if the Academy goes, after seeing the movie, we're not really going to consider it as a potential nominee because it's so integral to the film. The real question is, will enough people ultimately see it? And I think based on the shortlist, that's been told and defined, and it fits, I think, well within the kind of quote-unquote sound mixing slot here in the 5 picks. But now talking about some possible contenders, my first one being Wicked for Good, as I mentioned, maybe more of a traditional sound mixing type of a pick, a movie that I ultimately didn't include here though, because you're kind of trying to read the tea leaves of where we are right now and where the Oscars will be and when the Oscar voting will happen. And the more Wicked is, in theaters, the less people are seeing it, the less it's well appreciated and celebrated, not making as much money as the second movie, going to be a little bit more forgotten, I think, by the time Oscar voting happens. Whereas Sirāt is still a smaller international film, which is kind of increasing in terms of visibility. So I think Wicked will ultimately kind of be forgotten, and the sound isn't necessarily a part of the movie that jumps out at you. That being said, it is a little bit more of that traditional musical sound mixing kind of a pick. So the question is, is this movie going to be a real contender for something like Best Picture and get 6 or 7 other nominations? If it does, it gets nominated here. If it kind of underperforms, this is a place where it would underperform. So right now, being a little bit more cautious, trying to predict the future a few weeks down the road, how are people going to feel? And I think that it's going to be a little bit less Wicked fever, so I'm not going to include it in sound. And then my other possible contender would be Frankenstein. The team behind this largely has done just The Shape of Water in terms of Oscar nominations, so not super celebrated as a team, so it doesn't have that element to it, so I included it out. That being said, also on Netflix, so not a lot of people necessarily saw the film in theaters, which hurts it. That being said, though, it still is a big Oscar contender. It is action sequences at times, loud in terms of its integration with score, which I'm also predicting it here. So it is a contender potentially for some of the creature effects and sound effects that was created, and the dinginess and the horror gothic elements that it adds. But it's not a A-list team with a super crazy high budget and a blockbuster that people are seeing and noticing the sound. It's more so just, will they like the movie enough and the general ambiance that was created to give it a nomination? Absolutely, it's a possible contender, but it's not in my picks. Okay, now let's talk about the final category of this video, the Best Original Song category, with my first pick being, of course, Golden from KPop Demon Hunters. This is the only KPop Demon Hunters song that was really campaigned and the only one that made the shortlist, and I think is the frontrunner to win right now as well. It is a classic song that this branch loves. It's not an end credit song from a pop star. It's integral to the success of the film. It's about these pop stars. That's what the movie is, and it's a key song within the film itself. So definitely very likely to get nominated. Also got nominated for the Song Society of Composers and Lyricists, as well as the Golden Globes, and is the big kind of smash music, poppy kind of movie of the year, so definitely of the summer. And then my other possible contender would be I Lied to You from Sinners. This is the song that's played at the kind of dance sequence in the middle of the film. If you've seen the film, you know what I'm talking about. I think there'll be an intense appreciation similar to K-pop Demon Hunters, in which you have an original song that's so integral to the movie. It's not played over the end credits like the other Sinners song, which is why I went with this one in particular. Also showed up at the Golden Globes, where the other Sinners song didn't, so this seems to be like the clear frontrunner. Then you have a really well-liked movie in Sinners just generally, so people will want to feel the need to reward it in as many places, I think, as possible. Then my third pick, I went with Dear Me from Diane Warren, Relentless. And you don't need to know anything about this movie or anything about the song necessarily. The only thing you need to know is that this movie is about Diane Warren, the writer, and there's an original song about the film, also written by Diane Warren. So who's Diane Warren? Well, she is the most nominated person in this category's history. She's been nominated a total of 16 times, including, even more impressively, 8 years in a row. So we've been only doing this as our 10th season, and every year I've been betting on and predicting Diane Warren. And guess what? Every single year she gets nominated. It's an automatic kind of a pick. I mean, she's very well respected within this branch, even so much so as this documentary showing up for Best Score in the score shortlist. So it's a possibility that it gets nominated there. That being said, you don't really need to think too much about this. All you need to know is that Diane Warren has a new original song. This branch loves Diane Warren. She's been nominated 8 times in a row, a total of 16 times. Now this is a song for a documentary about her. Total slam dunk of a nomination included in there. Don't think about it. The song is called Dear Me. Don't need to know anything else, just that it's written by Diane Warren. Then my fourth pick, I went with The Girl in the Bubble from Wicked for Good. There are 2 original songs from Wicked for Good. Either of them could get nominated. They both got nominated at the Society of Composers and Song Lyricists, which is the guild, 4 songs. Also got nominated at the Golden Globes. Both of them, ultimately I just chose one because I do think one will kind of reign out. I don't think both of them will get in. And I went with The Girl in the Bubble because this is the song that Ariana Grande sings, and the other song is more of the Cynthia Erivo song. And I think that Ariana Grande is going to be a little bit more appreciated, get nominated for Best Supporting Actress, where I don't think Cynthia Erivo, at least at this time, will get nominated for Best Lead Actress. So I ultimately went with Ariana's song. And then my fifth pick, I went with Train Dreams from Train Dreams. And the reason why I went with this was because it did not get nominated at the Society of Composers and Song Lyricists. That's the kind of guild, and you may say, Connor, well, maybe it's a bad thing that it missed out, right? Actually, I don't think so. Because, for the past 2 years here, it's pretty rare that all 5 of the nominees have also gotten nominated at the Society of Composers and Song Lyricists. Pretty much every single year, there's at least one song that gets nominated at the Oscars that didn't show up at the Guild. And what are those songs? You had the Sing Sing song last year. The year before that, you had the Killers of the Flower Moon song. The year before that, you had the Everything Everywhere All at Once song. So you start to notice, okay, what's the pattern here? Well, these are Best Picture movies. These are movies that are a little bit more prestigious, and the songs that are maybe not obvious at first blush ultimately get in at the Oscars, because the Oscars are about prestige. The Society of Composers and Song Lyricists, they'll give Olivia Rodrigo the best prize for her pop song there for, in a Hunger Games. But the Oscars, they're focused more so on the films themselves and the prestigiousness, and they're not necessarily going to just nominate the pop stars just because they're pop stars. So Train Dreams fits into that mold. It fits more so into the mold of something like a Killers of the Flower Moon or Everything Everywhere All at Once, Best Picture nominees, or Sing Sing, which was probably not a Best Picture nominee, but the 11th spot. So even if you don't have Train Dreams in for your Best Picture, 10, I do. Even still, I think it would make sense to get nominated here because it fits into these types of films and songs from these films that didn't get in at the Guild, that did get in at the Oscars. It fits in that mold very well. And then you have the singer of the song, Nick Cave, who is not a pop star, but is a known name and is a well-respected artist in his own right. So there's, again, that element of prestige that's connected to this song. Then my other possible contenders, my first one is Salt, Then Sour, Then Sweet, from Come See Me in the Good Light, the documentary film. There's some big talent behind this name, Sarah Bareilles and Brandi Carlile, so you have some aspects of there too. The song itself is very much emotional and ballad type, which is what this branch really likes, rather than it being high-paced and kind of boppy and poppy and kind of easy to sing. They're more into the emotional ballads. I do think this movie is also going to get nominated at the documentary category, so there's a connection there. And then my other possible contender would be No Place Like Home, the other song from Wicked. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm going with the Ariana one, but there's no reason for that necessarily. This movie could just as easily be put in there, and maybe they both get nominated too. That's a real possibility as well, but wanted to include Train Dreams in part because of what I was mentioning. It didn't get nominated there at the Society of Composers and Song Lyricists, and usually there's at least one every year that we see the overlap not happen. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know your thoughts on this category. And stay tuned. Multiple videos a week for the next few weeks here as we get right into the heart of Oscar season. And yeah, I'd love for you to check out those other videos as well. But that's about it. Until next time, stay tuned.